And that can weigh heavily on the jury's consideration to recommend an aggravating circumstance, and it's something the judge can consider. Mitigating circumstances for former Officer Chauvin have to do with the fact that he does not have a criminal record. We know about multiple instances of misconduct, but that was when he was within the police department and there were no criminal findings there. And so he's someone who would has a lot of mitigating circumstances in his favor, and we know of at least one aggravating circumstances, which are the minor age of the witnesses of George Floyd's death.
Alexis Hogue, you break it all down so brilliantly. Sometimes difficult to understand this, but you make it easy to understand. Thank you so much. And want to bring back in Gail. And Gail, I'm thinking of, something that we've talked about in years past that I think makes this case so different. Not only the body cam video from the police officers, but all those witnesses, as the prosecutor Jerry Blackwell described it, that bouquet of humanity. All that video we heard, how you can't listen to that and not be so disturbed for the 10 minutes that those witnesses kept saying, screaming at the officers to get off of his neck, to get off George Floyd's neck.
Nora, it's so interesting that you pick up on that phrase, bouquet of humanity. Because when he said it, it just gave me the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, because I thought it was such a beautiful and brilliant way to describe the bystanders, who were sometimes characterized as an angry crowd. Number one, I looked at that tape over and over, and depending on your point of view, it was either 6 people at one point, or 11 or 13. I never saw any more than 13. 3 of them were high school students, including a 9-year-old girl. One was a mixed martial artist. And what I didn't see, and what many people did not see, was an angry, hostile crowd. What they saw was a very concerned and very fearful crowd. And I thought that Jerry Blackwell was very interesting in his closing yesterday when he came and said it was respect for the badge, that the people in the crowd didn't do more to prevent the death of George Floyd. Darnella Frazier, who took that video, has said that it has actually kept her up at night. I mean, so I think anybody who saw that, listen, I felt traumatized. I said this morning on CBS This Morning, Nora, I couldn't sleep last night. I couldn't eat last night. My stomach has been in knots because I was so worried about the outcome of this trial. However it goes, it's just a very emotional and dare I say, triggering situation when you look at that video. To see that video over and over and over again yesterday. So to your point, I think a lot of people were traumatized looking at the video, but in particular the jurors, who probably saw it more than any of us throughout this trial, and that's why we want to bring Jamie back in at this time. Because Jamie, you were one of the few people that actually got to see the jurors face to face. You were in the courtroom. I remember you reporting that they were taking copious notes and they were really paying attention. What can you tell us about the makeup of the jury?
They are a very engaged jury. They're also a very diverse jury. So you have a makeup where 6 consider themselves black or people of color, and 6 white, which is interesting here in Hennepin County because this county is 80% Caucasian. So this is a very diverse jury for this area. I went back through my notes and I saw that there's a chemist, a nurse, an auditor, a grandmother. This is a very, well-rounded jury in terms of the places that they come from.
And the questions they were asked to Jamie about how do they feel about the Black Lives Matter movement. Right. They had to fill out all sorts of questions about their biases and how what they were feeling about this particular case.
And one has a family member who's a police officer, another has a friend who's a canine officer. So when you talk about unconscious bias, some people may say, I only side with the police, whereas others, maybe some of the people of color, will say, I only want to side with George Floyd because I've been in his situation before. So that's why the judge, as you recall, in his instructions said to eliminate your unconscious bias and really look at the facts of this case and go back to your notes and see how you felt about certain things during the case.
It was extraordinary too, Jamie, from the judge to even mention unbiased and implicit bias. And he said we all have it, but that should not guide you. He said don't let your prejudice, your passion, your sympathy, or your public opinion influence your decision. But be aware that we all have unconscious and implicit bias, and maybe it's good to talk it out among other people that don't agree with you, that don't look like you. I thought that was extraordinary for a judge to even bring that up. Did you?
Absolutely. I think a lot of people were shocked that he actually talked about that in jury instruction.
Which is the last thing they heard before they go to deliberate.
Absolutely. One of the other notes I just wanted to point out to you, there were a number of jurors in their questionnaires who had not seen the entire video. So as we're talking about how triggering and traumatizing these videos, seeing them over and over and are several jurors who on their questionnaires to the court said they had either never seen the bystander video or had only seen certain parts of it. So that's
now
why
that surprises me.
Right.
Will there
I
show
could see
and
you
be
might
found
not have
guilty
seen
for the
the whole
murder
video, but
and
it
death
surprises me
of
that there were
George
some people who had never
Floyd?
seen the video at all.
Yep, that's how they answer the questionnaire. So we'll see how that plays out. I have to imagine if you had never
Nobody
seen
in
it
the
and
world
then you see
kept
it
their
over and over and over again, you may have a
knee
different
on
reaction than
his
some of us who
neck,
have
watching
seen the clips over and over and maybe became a little desensitized. So it'll be interesting to see how
and
that works
did
into the
his
decision making.
doing that contribute to the death of George?
What are we looking at?
I think this is, Gail, if I just
What
got
is
some
this,
text
Jamie?
from
Where
some
is
friends. This is outside the government center. I have a couple of friends who are there.
People are
who have been
waiting
texting me saying that
for
it's
the
almost become a crowd,
verdict.
like you would see if the Twins won the World Series. Obviously, the Minnesota Twins are the baseball
Yes.
team. We're just a few blocks from there. That this
Many
quickly the
people
crowd has gathered
outside
together, and that people seem
the
to be
courtroom
almost
are
excited that they think
waiting.
that this is a verdict that will be guilty, but that the crowd seems hopeful, and their gathering is almost kind of a celebratory act. So I think we're hearing.
Will justice
So
prevail?
quickly, it's such a large number, Jim.
That's what people are saying, is that they can't believe how quickly this has come together, and even some of my friends who are at work apparently left and are down there right now.
People
So
are waiting.
you know, this is in downtown Minneapolis. A lot of people, even with COVID, have been coming downtown.
The verdict
to go to work.
of the
And so
jury.
people now filling the streets.
All right, Gail and Jamie, thank you. We want to bring in Ibram Kendi. He's a CBS News contributor and lead anti-racist scholar. And Ibram, thank you so much for being with us. And I think about this past year, and George Floyd's death really launched a social justice movement, protests across this country. What does a guilty verdict mean for this nation? What about an acquittal?
Well, I think a guilty verdict means that the millions of people who took to the streets and were outraged about George Floyd's death, and in many of those demonstrations, they, of course, believed what they saw, which is that George Floyd was murdered. You know, that they would be affirmed. But I think a guilty verdict hopefully will also allow people like me, who do not feel that if something happens to me, even an extreme case in which it's obviously the case that I was not to blame, I would still be blamed for my own death. And there's this long history of black folks dying at the hands of police and being blamed for their own deaths. And I think if there is an acquittal, I think the rage, I think the outrage, I think the confusion, I think the hurt and the pain really of centuries will show itself. And I think people are looking for at least one case, at least one time, when the lives of black people are held up in value.
The lives of black people
Even when I was
matter.
just talking to Gail about this, we would be in a much
The
different
lives
place if there
of
wasn't
black
all of the
people
video
do
evidence that exists
matter.
today. You know, that bystanders, that
is gonna
bouquet
be
of
the
humanity can
case.
each stand there and act
This is
as
gonna be
recorders
the
of
court
history,
case that
you know,
will
to journal
show
exactly what's happening, to take us all to that very moment and essentially push
the
our own
lives of black
unconscious
people
bias away
matter.
from us, because when you see stuff with your own eyes, it can present a very different picture. And I think that, I wonder if your sense about how that has changed so much and what
This
still
court
needs to
case will
change.
change the
I think it certainly
cases
has
of the
changed
future
for some Americans who
and
wanted
show
to
that black
deny the stories
lives matter.
that people who had been victimized or violated or killed or brutalized by the police, who
Murder
wanted
and
to
death is
not believe that,
unnecessary.
who wanted to believe the police story.
Like it happened
You can see the video evidence.
as people
when
were
you can
watching,
see George Floyd
as people
crying
were
out for his
videoing
life, crying
what was
out for his
going
mother,
on.
crying out to breathe. It's hard
Crying
to
out to
imagine
breathe.
that he is to blame. And I think obviously other cases
Crying out to
similarly
breathe.
as well. And so, but I
can't
think we
breathe.
need to reach a
Get
point
me
in
off
this
my
nation
neck,
where
please.
we can believe the person who died we can
that
believe
was
witnesses who
murder
witnessed that person die at the hands of police
in the
without
nth
video
degree.
evidence.
Cam.
An abusive policeman, abusive Mr. Policeman.
Other than the videotape, which everybody agrees was egregious and very, very difficult to watch, was there any
killing
particular
a black
testimony that stood out to
person,
you?
refusing to move his knee off his neck
Yeah, to me,
as
the
others watched on,
testimony that
That's
stood
never a
out.
good sign. Sounds
awaiting
like
the
more
verdict
was
of the
Ibram.
jury in the
I can hear him.
Chauvin
Go ahead,
case
Ibram.
of the death of
Sure. To
George
me,
Floyd.
yes, I can hear you. To me, the testimony that stood out was the testimony of
But I cannot hear him. I don't think he can hear me.
was the testimony of the lung doctor, and when he was able to document precisely,
Seems to be in.
potentially when George Floyd died, when he was able to speak precisely about how he was breathing, when he was breathing. I mean, there were many testimonies, but I think his testimony, for me, was the most touching and was the most decisive.
It's an excellent point, Ibram Kendi. I know you'll stay with us. Want to bring back in Jeff Pegues because he is among the crowd there in Minneapolis and has covered this story from the very beginning. Jeff, give us a sense of the mood.
Well, Nora, the size of this crowd here behind me, it's really growing by the second, it seems. About half an hour, 45 minutes ago, there was really no one here. There was a lot
The
of
size
media.
of the
Don't get me
crowd.
wrong, but we didn't see a lot of protesters.
Looking
Now,
for the
we
verdict
see
of
a
the
larger
jury
group of
is growing.
protesters, demonstrators, whatever you want to call them. Some of them chanting Black Lives Matter. Others
Black
chanting,
Lives
this is what
Matter.
democracy looks like. And if this is what
This is what
democracy
democracy
looks
looks
like, well, then you
like.
also sell t-shirts. There's a guy who set up a table in about 2 seconds and whipped out his t-shirts, and he's handing out Black Lives Matter t-shirts. And then to my right here, there's another guy painting a portrait, and overlooking it all, you have this small contingent of members of the National Guard at the Hennepin County Government Center. That's where the courtroom is, and as I said earlier, you have the fencing here. So while there is this anticipation, there is also this concern about security. This has been peaceful. This has been peaceful so far. But of course, officials are concerned that there could be agitators who see this as an opportunity, something else that I mentioned earlier. But the reality is we have a growing crowd of people here waiting for this verdict. The word was getting out that perhaps it would have happened by now, and so you have people showing up trying to share in this moment. As I said, the
For
crowd is
the
getting
verdict
bigger,
of
maybe
the
a few hundred
jury
people, nothing more than that at this
in
time.
the death of
And if I
George
look
Floyd.
around, I pointed to the National Guard, but I don't see any police officers, that's for sure. Perhaps they
And the
are
man
the,
who had his knee on his
periphery
neck
of this
forever.
protest. That's typically the way they
At
do
least
things
10
these days when it
minutes
comes
or so.
to demonstrations like this. They try not to get involved.
Wouldn't listen to
too
anybody.
early,
No, no, no,
to
no, no,
stir
no, no.
things up. They try
Wouldn't
to
remove his
stay
knee
back,
from
give
George
people an
Floyd's neck
opportunity to
and kill
express
him.
their views. Nora.
Jeff, I
Unnecessary.
want to ask you about the role that social media
Looking
plays
for
in bringing out both
verdict
peaceful and non-peaceful
in the
protesters.
George Floyd case.
We have learned today that Facebook has actually called
The
Minneapolis now
verdict in
a
their Chauvin
high-risk
trial to
location,
be read
and they
shortly.
are identifying and removing calls to bring arms to Minneapolis. They also say they are removing material that, quote, praises, celebrates, or mocks George Floyd's death. So one social media company trying to weigh in there to prevent any potential unrest or violence. But this is what you covered, Jeff, and I wonder what you're hearing from law enforcement at this hour.
Well, as you noted, this is a concern, misinformation, and we saw it with January 6th, the insurrection. We were live on the air, and you had people showing up, people being told to go to the Capitol, and it was social media that played a role in that incident as well. And so many of these social media companies have had to learn these tough lessons that you can't just allow people to express themselves in a way where they're spreading misinformation as a good, positive business model. So you have Facebook today, you're right, taking this step to say, if you are among that group of people who chooses to spread misinformation, we're going to try and shut you down as soon as possible. The problem for these social
waiting for the verdict in
companies
the
that it's hard to do.
for
In fact, we've been looking at this issue for
verdict,
social medias for
the
social
verdict
media companies for years. First with their first when it came to fighting terrorist organizations.
Jeff, stand by.
Summation by the
I apologize,
judge.
Jeff. Let's listen now into Judge Cahill inside the courtroom.
All rise for the jury. Please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court File Number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, Juror Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, verdict, Count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by Jury Foreperson, Juror Number 19. Same caption, verdict, Count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury Foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror Number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror Number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. Be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
They would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
All right.
Thank you.
He could have.
Guilty, guilty, guilty on all 3
Derek
counts.
Chauvin was found
And
guilty
Officer Chauvin is now
in
headed
the
to
death
jail.
of George Floyd.
We're adjourned.
I know. I think, Nora, many people were surprised.
By a
many
jury
people
of
were
his
surprised to know
peers.
that he hasn't been in
Whoa.
jail all this time. That now, for the first time after sitting through the trial and being out, that he is now heading to jail tonight. But I have to tell you, when the verdict was read at 5:10 in our time, 5:05, 5:06, I mean, we started hearing horns honking. I think you felt jaws dropping. I think people thought maybe you'd get 1, but to get all 3, I think is a very stunning
Found
thing.
guilty
Says
on all
and to get a
3
unanimous
counts.
verdict too on all 3 charges.
Guilty, guilty,
I think is
guilty.
absolutely stunning. Says something to the case
Guilty,
that
guilty,
the prosecution
guilty.
put on and what the jurors believed. You know, when Jerry Blackwell said, "Believe what your eyes tell you, believe what you feel in your hearts," and apparently they did exactly that.
I got a little emotional myself, Gail, because, you know, so many people
Yeah.
were so worried that justice wouldn't come through. You know, that justice wouldn't come
Yes,
through, and that the resulting anger and fear would hit the streets. You know what I mean? And in many cities across America.
I know exactly
and
what
I
you
hope
mean.
that for many people that this is a sense that the justice system can work. And that, you know, the prosecution, you know, brought in some very powerful lawyers from across the country. They did a very good job trying to lay the case out, and the jury didn't even need to ask the judge a question.
And I think the defense once again tried to make, as often happens in these cases, to tarnish and taint George Floyd, to make it sound like he was responsible for his own death. But what you could not deny is that videotape. It's very hard to say that he continued, Derek Chauvin still continued to leave his knee on George Floyd's neck even after he had stopped breathing, after you could see that he had urinated, they were saying in the trial, that he clearly had no more life left in him. You literally saw on tape the life seep out of his body. And I think that, you know, you're right. A lot of people were very afraid because we've been this way before, where you did not see a conviction where you expected to see it. In Rodney King, for example, in the Eric Garner case. I mean, you know, in Trayvon Martin's death with George Zimmerman, even though he was not a police officer. You know, people have been let down and disappointed so many times that I've heard one friend of mine say it's almost dangerous to hope. And I do think that maybe this will restore some faith in the justice system that was really badly needed.